Hello guys, and welcome back to this very special Kiev Cultural Changemaker special. I'm of course your host and founder of the Interpreting Wine podcast, Lawrence Francis. And while I'm based in London, travelling and uncovering great new places is really part of who I am. And one of my biggest discoveries of the last year has been the city of Kiev, capital of Ukraine. This series of 9 interviews was recorded in October 2018 and in March 2019, and I hope captures a sense of not only what's happening in the food and drink scene, touching as it does on wine and local cuisine, but also captures a sense of where the city is heading through design, music and cultural change. And I hope that if you or anybody you know is planning to visit to the city, you'll use this series as an audio guide, both to discover fantastic places to eat and drink, and also understand some of the wider cultural context. So here we go, today's episode of the Kiev Cultural Changemaker Special. Today's episode of the Kiev Cultural Changemaker Special features Roman Zakharov of natural wine importer Frank Wines. In a country better known for its harder spirits, Roman is certainly a pioneer with the style of wines that he's bringing in and the restaurants that he's working with. We hear his origin story and transition into the wine world. We take a virtual tour of just what is Frank Wines, the business. He discusses the broader wine scene in Kiev. And of course, my favorite part, we got to try a couple of the wines on his list. Enjoy.
My name is Roman Zakharov. I run an importing company and distributor called Frank Wines. The company has been founded in 2017. We began operations in 2018. So the first shipment was actually in January 2018. Before that, I was involved in something very different than wine. I was in finance for 10 years, a little bit more than 10 years. All of that time was in Ukraine. After my stint in investment banking, there was a period where it was a good opportunity and the right time to take a sabbatical and reevaluate everything that was happening in the world, in the country, in my life at that time. And after a while, I decided that despite my strong resistance into a continuously building urge to do something more personal and more intimate with wine, maybe it was worth a try. And so the process of thinking and contemplating of what it could be in a way that wouldn't betray my philosophy and my kind of deeply rooted respect for wine has begun. It lasted for a few years. A few times we were on the brink of thinking, okay, maybe it's really not that possible to do what we want to do, and we don't really want to compromise. But at the end of the day, it actually all fell into place, and here we are.
So two really quite different worlds, I guess, that we're talking about there, the world of investment banking, the world of wine, which is, and sitting here recognizing, a few of the labels here, wine with soul, I might say, or, wine certainly with personality. I'm curious, what is the kind of almost the missing piece of that journey then, just in terms of how does one do that skill acquisition and that transfer? Was it more a case of you were like doing that learning already sort of alongside the banking, or when you decided to kind of make the leap, there was then a very intense period of learning and skill acquisition? Just take us a bit through more of that.
So you want the iceberg, the bottom part of the iceberg, yeah. Actually, the funny thing about finance and wine, they seem to be so far apart and yet so close together, because you can't spit 2 meters into the world of wine without hitting a ex-financier. So it's really, I think there's something that evokes similar feelings in people who are somehow associated with these two worlds. They could be very close to my story, or they could be very far apart. But in my case, the love affair with wine began actually with beer. It started with the rise and gradual penetration of craft brewing, of microbrewing in United States, where I was studying at that time. And that was my first exposure. Basically, I worked in the restaurants from very young age in the kitchen, and food was a big part of my life, and flavor and taste and combinations of that was something that always interested me. And at a certain point, I came across artisanal micro craft brews, and that really took the top off because it was very different. It was very different from the standard beers I tasted before, and I discovered that it could be a whole new world. And for a long time, I dove headfirst into that, explored it. Eventually, as I grew older, you start thinking, okay, beverage, food, beverage. What other beverage are there? Okay, there's wine. Everybody talks about wine with food. Maybe I should explore that. And that launched the first very awkward attempt into trying to understand what wine is and what it could be. Miserably failed the first few times, which is expected when you buy a $2 chuck from a grocery store shelf and pair it very wrongly with something it shouldn't be paired with. But nevertheless, I didn't have any horrible stories. It didn't kill the interest. It didn't kill the curiosity. It maybe suspended it for a little bit. But when I came back to Kiev after my studies in the States, I was lucky enough to come across a few people who were also interested in wine and who supported hands-on exploration, and who at that time knew a little bit more than I did. And so they pointed to a few wines which might be interesting to me. We started tasting together, and that was basically the beginning of the end. I realized that what I was tasting before was not really wine, it was plonk. I understood what was the big deal about wine, why it was great with food, and after that you just couldn't stop me. It was learning, tasting, exploring, trying to figure it out, which was very difficult at times, and I'm very grateful to those people who were kind enough to take in a newbie and share their thoughts and maybe point to a few directions of where I should go and where I shouldn't go. And so that was the beginning of a really intense, hands-on love affair with wine. So I would say there were two periods. One which was a little bit awkward and self-motivated, and second where I received some support, and then of course after that it was again back in my own hands. And so to answer your question, how this learning curve began and how it formed and where it began and so on and so forth, it basically all started in the late 90s, and since then it really picked up in the early aughts. So from about 2004 to about 2015, that was a very intense, active. Basically, my life was divided in two parts. It was my career and wine. As banal as it might sound, and the story that we've all heard before, that was it. At a very early point, I clearly made a distinction between tourism and immigration, or between drinking wine and making wine. Very different worlds, and I believe that most of the people who go into wine, whatever field it is related to wine, and maybe I'm a little bit naive in that, but at least initially, I believe that they're going there for the emotion and enjoyment and some sort of self-fulfillment. I don't think most of the people are driven by the same motivation as, for example, I don't know, mining for ore, or drilling for oil. Of course, at a certain point, some will diverge, and some will become very corporate, and some will remain very kind of emotionally invested. But yeah, in order to really enjoy what you do with wine, you have to be ready for it, because if you jump into making wine too early, it can be hellishly difficult and frustrating, and it will taste your spirit, and it will taste your commitment, and it will taste your resolve. So my hat's off to anybody who, first of all, changes the career as radically as people like that, and who go into the wine business really off the deep end, because it's much easier to go into retail or import than making wine.
I think the natural place to take it now, as we are sitting here in your showroom in the center of Kiev, is just to bring the listener up to date with what is the business now.
All right. So at the moment, the business is the same as it was originally conceived as. We are the importers of the low intervention wines from, at the moment, from Europe to Kiev. There's also a showroom as you said, in the center, in the old town. It's not a shop per se, so it's not a flow-driven business. This is more of a place for the tastings, for people to pop in the evening for a couple of hours and pick up a bottle and go home. But it's not a retail shop as is. This is where we do gatherings. This is where we taste with the sommeliers. This is where we invite vignerons if they come. So at the moment, the focus is primarily on working with the restaurants, and going forward, the business model is based primarily on that, is to help young, interesting, or maybe not so young, but people who are creative, people who are conscious about interesting flavors, interesting food, interesting presentation, who are coming about to understanding the importance of having beverage component to the dining experience, to create something interesting, to create something which is theirs, which is not common, which is not repetitive, regardless of where you go. And making that, this is actually one of the reasons, one of many reasons that originally ignited that flame of passion for the wines that we bring in, is that they're so fantastically good with food. They intensify and they transform the flavors which you're already used to into something different, because they're so open, because they're so off the beaten track, without necessarily having to be very crazy or very funky, but they're just much more emotionally charged in terms of flavor and in terms of everything else. So this is, in a way, part of our mission, is to give people who are really in love and focused on food and flavor and experience and emotion, to be able to do that not only with what's on your plate, but also with what's on the glass, what's in the glass. And of course, stepping outside of that, there are many people who can and do that at home for themselves, and I'm one of them. I dine at home a lot more than I dine out, so I definitely want to have something good in my glass as well. And we are not going to leave those people behind, and that's why the showroom also gives an option for somebody as a retail customer to come in and buy it, to take it with them home. But the idea is not to make it a high street kind of flow-driven business, because we're quite small. Basically, I'm the only person who is the front of the house, and everybody who comes in, they speak to me, and I talk to them. And this is important in order to give people the most enjoyment out of the wine that they will buy, because sometimes they will not be used to that flavor. Sometimes this will be something very different from what they've experienced before, and in order to understand it, in order to enjoy it, you have to give them some background. You have to give them some system of coordinates in order to understand why they should pay attention to this, what they should expect, how it will be different, why they shouldn't be afraid of that, how they should accentuate that or the other nuance of the wine with something that they will be having tonight. If you don't do that, there is a much higher risk of failure than success, because unknowingly a person might pair wine with completely different dish, or serve it in a completely different way, or be held back by some preconceived notion or by stereotypes, which will prevent him or her to open up and to actually listen to themselves and to listen to what's in the glass. And this is my job. This is my job, to help them to actually understand what to expect and how to enjoy it. And eventually they will start to learn more and trust themselves more and become more open. And so this is the small retail part, which is very important as well, because it's partially educational. And since the Ukrainian scene for this type of, I would say, wine experience, because in terms of food, people are a lot more open than in wine yet, and especially with the low intervention wines. So the community needs a little bit of support to establish themselves, to establish some understanding of what to do with it, how to do it, how to enjoy it. And I'm here to help this. I remember myself when I was just starting to learn about wine, starting to understand. I had a million questions, and at that time, very little internet support. So it was either printed or in person. And that's why I said at the beginning, I'm very grateful to those people who were kind enough to lend their experience and share their advice and to point me in the right directions. And this is what I want to give to people now who are just starting to come to it, because guidance is important.
As I mentioned at the start, I'm very hopeful that there will be people listening to your interview and listening to the series, and will consider coming to visiting Kiev. And I think we'll potentially also want to try your wine. So I don't know if you could just talk us through some of the places that you're supplying and where some of those people who are coming might go to find your wines when they're here.
Sure. Actually, it's always a tricky question because you don't want to leave anybody out. So if I do, please don't kill me next time you see me. And of course, the list is always changing, and the wines in different restaurants, different bars could be a little bit different. Some, because of their cuisine, prefer a little bit more stylistically cleaner wines. Some prefer a little bit more funky, but I mean, we're definitely doing great things with the 1818 bar, rooftop bar at Bursa. the new hotel on Podil. We're working with a few restaurants of the Gusovsky Group, namely the Napoleon Au Café on Mechnikova Street. We are launching pretty good. I'm very excited about this collaboration with a new restaurant that's opening actually this Saturday called Good Girl. It will be very, very interesting and very close to my heart approach to food. Very light, very delicate, yet interesting. We're doing some interesting things with the new guys just down the street from us. It's a neo bistro called Assembly. Who else? We're working with La Familia group of restaurants. Fantastic, best wine restaurant in Odessa called Bernardazzi. We've been working with them from day one. Who else? I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody, but yeah.
What I always like to do in these sorts of settings is invite you to select a wine or two from what we've got here behind us and take us inside the glass. Tell us a little bit about the history, why you're stocking this, and maybe a little bit about how it's received.
Sure. All right, so what we have in the glass at the moment is Muni Montemagro from a vigneron called Daniele Piccinin. He's from Veneto. And this wine is made from 100% local grape called Durello or Durello. It's quite commonly used in the industrial production of sparkling wine in Veneto because of its piercing acidity and ability to keep the acidity even at late harvest. But very few people work it the right way in the vineyards, and very few people make it as still wine. Primarily because, as with Prosecco, industrialization really pushed people to reduce any effort and focus on the margins rather than on the taste and on individuality. And Daniele, he's a young guy, very much in the kind of the age group of the guys like Michael and Klaus. He is actually a former chef. He also owned a restaurant in the area, and through the kitchen, through the food, and through his search for the right quality produce, he came to wine. He came to understanding the difference between the wine made in a low intervention way and the industrial wine, and eventually he left the kitchen side of life and went back to his grandmother's vineyards and grandmother's cellar. He was lucky enough that on the top of the hill in the middle of the Soave area, he actually had very old vines of Durella. And it took him a while to figure out what exactly is the potential and how to work with it, because there's really not much knowledge to be shared with from the old timers, because nobody really worked it that way. And so it took him a few years to figure it out. He realized and completely fell in love. He's one of the, if not the strongest advocate of Durella in the area. He continues to learn and to refine his understanding. And Montemagro is one of two wines which he makes 100% Durella. The second one is Meta Champenois sparkling wine with 2 years Surly called Muni Ariona. And the fantastic part about Montemagro and the fact that it's 100% Durella is that we had a very interesting trifecta of the vintages 14, 15, and 16, and they are all very, very different. 14 was a very difficult vintage, very little sunshine, lots of rain, difficult harvest, difficult maturation, and the wines came out. Of course, the harvest was much lower than average, but as throughout Italy, those who persevered and those who decided that they will fight till the end managed to rescue and recover a small portion of it in the late days of fall. And the results that they received were absolutely fantastic. So 14 gave us very precise, laser-like acidity, very mineral Chablis style kind of wines, very low alcohol. Then 15 was a completely opposite. It was super hot, super dry, very ripe, lots of harvest. So the wine ended up being, and this is the vintage which really showcased the beauty of Durello, because we had very ripe aromatics, a little bit higher alcohol, but at the same time, because of the acidity content, the wine was fresh. So you had this explosion of yellow ripe fruit, and at the same time, nothing flat in the texture and the vibration. It was super acidic and lovely. And the 16 is more towards the classical vintage. It's very balanced, it's very clean, it's very precise, but at the same time, it gives this kind of yellow Meyer lemon sensation, or maybe dried lemon sensation on the nose, and at the same time, the acidity that is the defining line for the Durello. And the cool thing about it is you have 3 vintages, and as a chef, you can, if it fits your style, you pierce the wines through your whole cuisine, but you pair very different dishes with it. So the 14s would go fantastically well with anything crudo, with seafood crudo, with ceviche, with anything like this. The 15s are absolutely amazing with the porcini risotto, with something autumnal, with something very kind of rooty. And the 16s, man, they're so universal. You can, depending on what you want to pair them with, you can really play on anything from starters to main courses. For example, we were pairing this with Brussels sprouts at assembly, Brussels sprouts and the pomelo and grapefruits juice, and it works. It works well because of a little bit of savoriness, not super fruity aromas, high acidity, and a little bit of this herbaceousness. So I think Daniele is one of the most talented, definitely one of the most hardworking guys I've ever met. The guy doesn't stop. He just had his 3rd daughter last year, 3 kids on his arm. He's always nonstop, either in the vineyard or trying to build up the cellar. And he's so committed. He's so enthusiastic about bringing back the glory and actually establishing this autochthonous variety in the area, which is over-industrialized, overlooked as a source of something interesting and something new. And I'm very grateful and very happy that I've discovered him a long time ago, and I'm super happy that we're working with him. Great response. Funny enough, it's actually very interesting because you have very different crowd who fell in love with the 14 and the 15 and the 16, and every wine finds its own crowd. And of course, there is some core audience that goes throughout because they already understand the stylistic foundation, and they become loyal to the grape that they've never even known before about. So yeah, for me, this is one of those guys, and a lot of, actually, he's not the only one like that. And these are the vignerons which I'm passionate about and which I want to work with, who I want to help to spread the word and get people more excited. Because to me, this is heroic winemaking and vine growing. because these are guys who are going basically not against all odds, but they're not following the common, easily accepted route because it will give them more money. They are so deeply and passionately involved in and rooted in what they do, and have such a strong connection with the place and with the grape that for them, wherever they forego some financial benefits, they receive in love, and they receive in feeling of actually achieving something. And if I can be part of that story, which will also help them feel comfortable, on all ends, balanced, then I'm completely behind it, because he gives to me so much with his wines and the energy. And I definitely, want to share that with people. Okay, so we're staying in Italy, but we're moving on to a little bit more sunny southern area of Campania, which is down closer to the Hilo de But, right across from Sicily. And this is actually a not very typical wine for Campania. It's a red sparkling, which is something, a mix of it's a Patnat slash metodo ancestrale. It's a blend of Aglianico and Barbera. The secondary fermentation is done by adding the chilled, unfermented, or the must that has not finished the fermentation for the same wine, for the same vintage, but added to the already finished completely fermented wine in the spring. So they start the fermentation before New Year's. They take some off, put it in the cooler. The fermentation stops. Some residual sugar is still left in the must. When the rest of the wine is fermented in the spring, they add whatever they chilled, put the crown cap, fermentation ensues. That's it. It's done. So no filtration, no disgorgement, not quite a pet nat because we're adding something in. So there's a secondary fermentation, but because we're adding the wine itself, it's basically is kind of a pet nat. And metodo ancestrale, which they would call there. These guys called Casebianche. It's a family couple of architects who moved from Naples to the hometown of Pasquale in Cilento, which is in one of the largest nature preserves in Italy. It's a little bit south of Naples. And that's where the vineyards of their family vineyards were for a long time. They made some wine before. They haven't really produced it commercially. And at a certain point, they decided that it would be best for them and the kids to move away from Naples into a more pristine and more nature, kind of clean environment. And they've started playing with different frizzante wines, because both Betty and Pasquale, they, not unlike me, are big lovers. Well, now I drink a lot less of this, but this is how my journey in wine began, with artisanal beer. And they are big lovers of small microbrews. And every time I go visit them, we go out, have a new version of some crazy concoction of artisanal pizza, which is made by a new guy, from a different dough, from a different mother. And it's all paired with something new in terms of beer. But at a certain point, they decided that it's not fair that Neapolitan pizza is only served with beer. Yeah, we're in the wine country. And we all know that pizza and bubbles are one of the best combinations. So they made 3 sparkling wines, very low sparkles. So it's not a sparkling like you would expect from a champagne or a prosecco. It's more of a frizzante. So they made a red, a rosé, and a white or an orange, depending on what you might want to call it. And the red is it's called Pashka, and you have the mustache and the hat on the label, which refers us to the Turkish Pasha. And there's a story behind that I'll tell you in a second. So they made this red, which is a blend of Aglianico and Barbera. They made a rosé, which is 100% Aglianico. And they made a white col fondo from Fiano. And when I asked Pasquale about why Pashka, the story is funny in a way, because Pasquale and Betty, you have these very lovely, open, very intellectual, very sophisticated people, and you understand that when you have discussion with them. But in appearance, they don't strike you as somebody who would put that food forward. They're very simple. They're very much farmers right now, although back in the day they were the architects, and there is no pretension whatsoever. So when you see them, you see a hardworking farmer. And we were sitting with Pasquale and said, "Why Pashka?" I said, "Well, one day me and my friend we were sitting in a spa," and that already is a little bit funny when you have this farmer sitting with his friend in a spa. He said, "We're sitting like Turkish pasha in Turkish baths." So that's good. Maybe you should call one of your wines Pasha. And then they started to brainstorm a little further, and actually Pashka, spelled a little bit differently, but it's a dialect for Pasquale in that area. So it's a little bit of play on word on his name, and also that experience that they had. And now we have the Pashka. This is, for me, this is a fantastic wine. It's absolutely fantastic wine to have in the summer and not necessarily just with pizza, because of course if you have pizza with some meat on it and it needs a little bit more support than just bubbles or just something light, because here you have a seriously made red wine behind it, and as you can see, when the bubbles go away, you still drink the wine as it is without having to justify that, now it's bubbly wine that has completely lost the bubbles. In the summertime, when you really want a little bit of red, but you don't want to over chill something that is more serious, and you always have to look for the compromise. You either go for rosé or you have to go for the sparkling. It's always nice to have a red, which is chillable, which is still serious, but yet not pretentious, and it's sparkling. And I mean, I love Lambrusco. I love one of the guys that I work with from Emilia-Romagna. Of course, they're outside of Lambrusco zone, but it's Scadenoci. They make fantastic reds, different style, but nevertheless, sparkling reds are, I think, dry sparkling reds are one of the most underappreciated categories in the wine world today, and they make some absolutely fantastic food pairings, and they're so universal and they're so off the beaten track for most of the people, not of course not the professionals, but most of the people, that I think this is where you really can blow the lid off in terms of emotion and new flavor combinations.
I'm not really going to add anything on there, I don't think, in terms of talking about the wines themselves, because you've been there, you've spoken with the winemakers, you've kind of brought those stories back. What's really just going through my head right now is just how good an ambassador wine is really for the stories and the people. I mean, because in a sense, we were sort of debating before about whether or not these wines are available in London. They probably are, let's assume they are. But somewhere over in London, there could be somebody sharing those stories as well, and having those wines, and I love for the Mooney, the different vintages and the different appeal and kind of the different crowds, and back to you can't please everybody all of the time. Again, perfectly illustrated through the wine, and then here to that. I just want to say versatility. I'm a versatility freak. I just love these wines that you don't just have with Christmas dinner. You have them any time of the year, any season. And I think it's lovely that these wines are here, out there in the world, telling their story. But of course, with you as the ambassador, really, as kind of the representative for the winemaker here, telling that story on their behalf, but with the product here to then really bring it home in a kind of a sensory way. Just to kind of close off really today, I just want to say a huge thanks, for your hospitality. And I just think you're sitting here in a really interesting part of your journey, an interesting stage of your journey. And I just sort of invite you to look ahead and, tell us what do you think is going to be happening in the coming time for Frank Wines?
Sure. We'll test my predicting abilities, but no, what's out in the future for us, or what I would like to be in the future for us, is definitely raising awareness of how broad and how different the wine can be. Giving people an opportunity to discover something that lies outside of the norm, which has been imposed on them for so many years. Giving people an opportunity to enjoy new flavors. We'll be playing our part by, first of all, relaying that message, educating people, giving them an opportunity to try it in the restaurants here, expanding our selection. This is something on the books because we are quite small, and this year we've added a few vignerons to our portfolio and a few more are on the way, so look out for summer 2019. There will be an expansion and hopefully a little bit more in the final quarter of the year. Hopefully we'll be getting more people on board and more people psyched and excited about the new flavors.
Thank you so much, Roman, for your time. I really feel that through your episode, we got an insight into the culinary scene in Kiev, and I'm sure some great recommendations to check out when you're in the city. You can, of course, find below the website and Instagram handle for Frank Wines. So do be sure to get in touch if you're in need of wine in Kiev. The website to check out all things interpreting wine is interpretingwine.com/listen, where you can find Interpreting Wine on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Next time on the podcast, in episode 316, we shift the focus back to Ukrainian food with Yevgen Klopotenko. See you then.